All right, I'll call this meeting to order. We're having reports on two items, the sidewalk on Stribling Avenue and a discussion on the budget developments to date. Ms. Thomas, would you do roll call, please?
Mayor Walker,
Present.
Vice Mayor McGill,
Here.
Councillor Hill,
Here.
Councillor Payne,
Here.
Councillor Smith,
Here.
All right. And so the first up, we have the sidewalks on Stribling Avenue. Mr. Dawson. Welcome.
Good afternoon. So actually, I'm going to go first. Actually, James is on his way to my office. He's having technical difficulties with his camera. He was going to start and then have Jack follow him.
Would you like for us to wait?
Yeah, he's running up right now. We could just give him a minute.
Okay, we'll do that.
I guess what I can do in the meantime is showing my skill on filling time. Ultimately, what we're going to do is he's going to frame the conversation for you all this evening and just share with you features of the project. And then Jack will give the specifics on the technical side, which is really to help us understand what the cost associated with the sidewalk improvements are. And then we'll talk a little bit about the impact to budget for you all to be able to consider the item forward.
Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. I didn't hear exactly what Sam just said. All right. Sorry, I've been having some technical difficulties with my computer this afternoon.
So that's okay, and my apologies. I didn't ask if you all were ready, so that's on me.
No worries. So as many of you know, there's a PUD rezoning proposed for 240 Stribling Avenue. The proposed project includes a mix of apartments, townhouses, two-family units. And depending on how the site lays out when they get into final design, it could include as many as 170 units. The developer at this point has proffered 15% of those units to be affordable at 60% of AMI. So as many of you know, for many people within the community and on the Planning Commission, a critical issue in consideration of whether to rezone this property or not is the status of the sidewalks on Stribling Avenue itself. Stribling Avenue does not currently have any sidewalks on it. It sees a fair amount of traffic and it's a relatively narrow street as it exists today. And there's a great deal of pedestrian traffic as well. So in response to those concerns, the developer prepared a conceptual design in order to generate a cost estimate for sidewalks. And based on that work, the developer has offered $2 million to be paid back from the revenue, from the future tax revenue of the project. So since then, as I believe Sam was just saying, staff has been working to further refine that number based on additional cost factors. And Jack Dawson, city engineer, is here to provide that information. So I guess with that, Jack, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. And I don't know if I can get my little slideshow presentation up. Can I share my screen or?
You can share your screen.
Okay. All right. So if I do. I apologize. Here we go. So then share. There we go. Share. All right, can you all see that? Let me know. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I believe most, if not all, or maybe some were at the Planning Commission meeting about a month ago when this was discussed. This is a Stribling Avenue cost estimate analysis. This is not an estimate. Last time I practiced this, it took me about 18 minutes. I'll do the best I can. Feel free to ask questions if you need to. And with that, we'll get started. So as I said, this is not an estimate. The typical way that we do estimates is We identify the projects. This comes from our litany of prioritization manuals and handbook Streets That Work, Bike and Ped. We then prioritize the projects, and then typically we try and do a planning study of a number of those projects, which would generate more qualitatively what projects are more expensive than others. And at that point, once we have, that's the original estimates generated with sort of a planning study of the potential to develop these projects. And then once the project's selected, it's developed at what's called a 30% design, or it's sort of a conceptual design phase. And that's when alternatives are evaluated. And that's when the cost is revised again. And then it goes to 60% design, which is typically considered when the design is quote unquote finalized. And there's some more cost estimates at that phase. And then typically we work through 90% where all the final details are sorted out. And then the real cost here comes at when the project's bid, which I do think is important. Even when we're working with very good estimates, you cannot control how the bids are going to come back. And, living through what we just lived through with logistics and costs, supply chains and all that stuff, things can get out of control.
Jack, Brian Wheeler here. We're getting some blue bars on your presentation. Do you want me to share the
If you
PDF?
would.
Let me do that.
Sure.
And then you can just tell
Is
me.
this the ADA PDF?
Not sure.
That's going to be a struggle because that doesn't have pictures and whatnot.
It's whatever was in the council packet.
Okay, this will work so far, I think. We might have an issue when we get to pictures and the like.
Okay, go ahead and tell me when to advance.
Okay, so this is more of an over under than an estimate, as I said, and this is sort of where I put my money on being over. So this is not an existing priority project, so we have minimal background information. We've sort of done planning analysis before, but that's about it. This has a 20% contingency, again, as the design gets finalized and the cost typically goes up. The estimates typically go up as contingencies increase in this process. So this is 20%. Typically, I'd use a larger one at this point, but I try to be as accurate as possible. This has not gone through community engagement or stakeholder meetings, which can add significantly to a project, as you may be aware. And then projects of this type are not insignificant undertakings, nor are they cookie cutter in design, typology, or execution. A sidewalk is not just a sidewalk. I've talked about that before, but infill, this is all developed. We're trying to wedge something into an area where it has not been wedged in before, and there's always other issues with that. And so I have a revised layout here, removing both sidewalks from both sides of the road and just putting it on one, which is where the city's always felt we'd get the most bang for our buck. But that layout is just preliminary. It's not a final plan or anything. You can advance, Brian. Okay, so the considerations that I use for designing streetscapes in these developed corridors is the right-of-way takes. Again, the right-of-way varies in size. It's about 25 feet. The consultant provided a 5-foot sidewalks on both sides for a 33-foot right-of-way. Putting that 33 feet in what's 25 feet now requires taking right-of-way to facilitate that. The second category for costs is the driveway tying costs and temporary easements associated with doing work on private property. The third is drainage requirements. The fourth is stormwater impacts. The fifth is utility relocation, and the sixth is roadway improvements. I did not have as much time as I hoped to get into this, so I didn't get too much into number 5 and number 6, but I'll discuss that when we get there. And then the other non-price impacts I wanted to point out are there are going to be existing parking reductions, and there'll be tree canopy removed as well. Next slide, Ryan. So the steps taken here was to analyze the existing corridor for physical constraints with retaining wall, challenging driveway tines, et cetera, and some preliminary safe crossing zones to revise the layout to sidewalk on one side. I then took the estimate that was provided and compared with the revised layout to sort of come up with areas where costs are likely to escalate and try and put some costs on those numbers, as well as qualify the non-cost related impacts. And then I revised the estimate for the likely escalations that I just discussed. Next slide, Brian. So this is the provided concept. All right, there we go. This will work. Here we go. Perfect. So this is what was provided to my office by the developer and their team. You can see the red hatching on this indicates where right-of-way would need to be taken. So you could sort of use your imagination to back out where it's not wide enough as is. The center line and alignment was essentially held to be the same point, which I think is a good practice. That means if you were to stand out there in the middle of the road right now where it's crested, that would be the future crest of the road. And then it largely follows the same alignment with obviously the widening, editing that some. but you can see there's sidewalks on both sides. It starts at the bottom right here. That is JPA. You can see Sunset Roads at the middle top with Huntley Road being at the left of this bend. Brian, if you'd advance it, please. It comes up through this bend, crosses the area that was Huntley Hall is at the bottom middle, the large parcel there. And then it proceeds to the top where you can see the conceptual future development or 240 Stribling hatched there in gray with the developed area. Next slide, please. Okay, so the existing corridor analysis, what I did was I just looked at the existing physical constraints, utility poles, grading challenges, and I whittled it down some. So hopefully this next slide will work functioning. Yeah, that's going to be a problem. Okay, well, at any rate, I'll do my best. If you look at those, this is a jumble of 3 pictures on top here. I put photo circles down there at the bottom. The first one, which you cannot see, shows the property that's on the south side of Stribling, abutting JPA, and there's just not a whole lot of room there. And then the next 2 pictures, which are represented by those 2 photo location bubbles, show this rather steep slope that's covered up by the one picture. And the second picture shows that slope further down. You can actually see that retaining wall in the first image. And while the provided plan, you can see those steep grading areas in the black contours in the vicinity of my 2 circles. We can't, that's what the developer is showing, replacing that slope. That's correct, Brian. Replacing that slope when the sidewalk's constructed, but we can't build back a slope at 1-to-1. That's outside of our regulations. We have to use ideally 3-to-1, if not 2-to-1. And so what that 10 feet of disturbance looks like is really turns into 30 feet of disturbance in that yard when you cut those slopes. So that area was avoided. You can go to the next slide, Brian. It's going to give us the same problem here, but looks like you can actually see most of the pictures for the most part. The one, as you move down past in front of Stribling or Huntley Hall, you can see some of the conflicts here. So if you look at the top left where that Mini is, that red Mini parked there in the gravel, that's right across from Huntley Hall, more or less. And you can imagine if you were to put a 5-foot sidewalk in that area, you know, if someone was walking down that sidewalk, that Mini would be in the sidewalk, especially if it wasn't a Mini and it was a full-size car. You would not be able to fit that in there. And if my pictures aren't covering each other up, you could see that that retaining wall beyond that Mini is collapsing. And the city has no business or interest taking a backhoe and trying to rebuild parking on that wall, replacing that wall, et cetera. If you look at the picture on the right, that is, I guess, just beyond Huntley Hall on the left. That's a similar situation where you can see that white car. The front of that is almost to the pavement as is. The existing pavement 17 feet in some places. So by the time you make that 20 feet, add a retaining wall, we'd eliminate all that parking and necessitate a project to replace all that parking. And then similarly at the bottom right corner, you can see where there's a whole lot of existing parking there serving sort of a apartment building there. And you can just see from where that existing gutter line is that we wouldn't be able to fit a sidewalk in there. So that kind of sums up where I ended up with the revised layout. And Brian, if you could go to the next slide, please. Next slide. So here's the revised layout. Looks like I missed a chunk of purple here on the bottom on top of Stribling, but the conceptual layout, this is not a design. This is a conceptual layout as I walked it, looking at those physical constraints and making assumptions about where logical crossing places would be. The purple is the new sidewalk and the orange would be crossings. Again, not set in stone, but based on obvious field conflicts that I discovered. So it would cross down, you go beyond Sunset on the north side, then cross to the south side of Stribling, cross Huntley. Next slide, please, Brian. Cross Huntley again, you'd be on the south side, and then you'd cross in the vicinity of 220 Stribling, which to avoid some of those retaining wall conflicts. And then it would continue on the north side till it returned you to the subject property. That's the development you can see at the top center. Next slide, please. So moving on to cost escalations, as a reminder, it's right-of-way takes, then driveway tie-in costs, drainage requirements, stormwater impacts, utility relocation, and roadway improvements. Next slide. So this is the right-of-way takes. Again, I left the right-of-way at 33 feet, even though there's a sidewalk on either side, especially since we don't know where that sidewalk will go. This is straight off the consultant's tabulation. They did not price this, but this would be roughly $42,000 worth of right-of-way take. That's permanent right-of-way takes. Next slide, please. So this category is the driveway tying costs and temporary easements. This gets a little complicated, but this is very important. So I took as example 109. This is one of the first ones that I noticed was impacted pretty significantly. This is towards Stribling side. You can see 109 is on the top side there. Where it says gravel, there's a rather wide driveway on either side, right where Brian's got the cursor. I think they could fit 3 or 4 cars in there right now. If you advance the slide, please. You can see 109 right there in the middle where it's the proposed right-of-way typical symbol is. If you look outside that red right-of-way take, there are 3 solid black lines there. What that indicates is approximately 1.5 to 2 feet of fill as you're building up your curb and building a 5-foot sidewalk. That would be a vertical delta between if you were standing at the edge of that sidewalk right now and where that driveway currently is right now. That driveway, that sidewalk is going to be about 18 to 24 inches above that existing asphalt or gravel driveway rather. Next slide. How that's relevant. So this is from another plan set of ours. Let me just make sure I credit everybody. RK&K prepared this exhibit for us for Fontaine Streetscape. They prepared this little thing on bottom where they inserted what I drew a purple line over, which is their modified grade tie-in. Again, when you're widening streets, adding vertical gain via sidewalks and driveway lips, it creates issue tying back into that driveway. So I showed that 1.5 foot delta and I drew that green line in approximately at what the existing slope is. And just using their calculations for how quickly they could chase grade. And this is to do things like make sure you don't tear bumpers off of low cars and things like that when you're making these tie-ins. I got 33 feet necessary to do. That's just sort of a little bit of math there. Brian, next slide, please. And so you can see here, yeah, my little sequencing isn't working, but that gray area represents the area that would need to be built in order to tie their driveway in from the proposed road surface. I hope that's making sense. And so if you look at that, like that purple contour I drew in, that's a contour line that ties in with the 519. So the 519 would not have a 6-inch jump there. It would gently slope up with a driveway entrance. And the green shows the 518 contour that would need to be graded in, maintaining the existing crossover of their driveway. And the problem with that is that the existing flow path, well, 1, that's quite expensive. And 2, the existing flow path is that sort of blue sweeping line you see going through the middle of the screen, ending at the left. That's where the water flows right now. That's correct. It goes from right to left. And if you fill in a driveway, we're forcing all of that water into the front of their house, which necessitates either a rather complex drainage system or a system of culverts underneath the driveway or something. And I'll show a little bit of that next here, Brian, next slide. So this is, I think, 105 screen center. You can see how the water from 105 drains towards the driveway of 109. Next slide. Again, similar picture. In front of that red car is roughly the channel there. So if you can imagine where that seam between the gravel and the asphalt is, or really probably 3 feet, 4 feet to the left of that, there'd be concrete approximately 2 feet higher than it is right now, the way that drops off. Next slide, please, Brian. Again, the water does not flow in between those buildings to the rear yards. It flows to the left. Next picture. Again, I think we're at about 111 to 113-ish. The water is still draining where that depression is in their timber there. You can almost see it where it pools up there. Next picture. And then you can see 109, I believe, is that Mercedes. So you can see how much fall there is. Again, if you imagine that sidewalk that you can see on the picture right, continuing up and continuing over that driveway, that's where you get the physical constraints from tying all these things in. Next picture, Brian. So adding all that stuff up, that driveway would be about $17,600. And this is not, this is using line items for asphalt, fill, stone, and then temporary right-of-way takes. And I just threw $2,500 per driveway in there for culverts or other accounting for whether it's yard inlets or a system to convey the water. Next slide. So this is another driveway example. This picture doesn't do this driveway slope justice, but this is at 143. This is a pretty aggressive drop off. You can see the retaining wall there. Again, depending on the sidewalk impacts, this would be a pretty considerable tie-in. You can see that delta I've identified in that schematic is 3.5 feet vertical delta. So you're roughly chasing this driveway 45, 50 feet down there with non-erodible surface as the code requires. Next slide. Again, a few more. This is a big circle driveway. Looks like it's, I think, across from like 128 or so. We got a 1 foot vertical delta and a 2 foot vertical delta. That picture shows it pretty well. Next picture. Next slide. So now we're moving on to basic drainage requirements. So this is not totally unrelated to what we were talking about earlier. Next slide. So right now, and this is where a lot of the cost comes in, water hits the road, it sheet flows off of the road into yards. It might flow through those yards somewhere else. Right now, this is at the first outfall upstream. This is the inlet that receives that. If you were to convert this to a curb inlet and build a curb behind it, a 6-inch curb, you're creating a pond beyond that elevated area where water cannot flow across the sidewalk. So you either have to chase grade in those people's yards 20 feet to promote flow across the sidewalk, or next slide, and associated with the driveways, create that little pink square and pink line in the middle is what would be done there to drain the pond that we've created in front of all those yards that is being bermed or impounded by the new sidewalk. Next slide. On-road drainage as a result, spread requirements, I think is what that says. So similar problem. This is down near Huntley Hall. You can see the green area. That's about 1/2 acres that drains towards what I believe is outfall 3 here, which is just where that green line ends on the left in front of 220. I just did some very rough calculations, next slide, for this, and using the 2-inch rainfall, which is 3.7, which is actually less than the VDOT requirement of 4-inch intensity, we're getting a discharge of about 0.96 flowing down that curb line. Next slide. The result of that is a spread of 7 feet. VDOT says you cannot have that rain intensity go more than half of your lane width if there's no shoulder, which is 5 feet. So that exceeds it. Next slide. Even if you cut that discharge more than half to 0.4, we're still just meeting it. So what that means to me is we need at least 2 inlets there. Next slide. So you can see where that pink on the road are 2 inlets and 2 storm drains draining that water, so that when you curb all this stuff, it doesn't flood in every rainfall and create problems with icing, splashing, the whole thing for basic road requirements. Next slide. And this is outfall 4 down across from the subject property. I did a similar calculation. There are probably some inlets required there. Again, this is not exhaustive. It's just to demonstrate when you start looking at these things, how expensive they get. Next slide. Now we're moving on to stormwater impacts. So this is both quality and quantity. Next slide. This is a VRM sheet. This is what we use to calculate quality reductions required. I assumed 8-foot section, I believe, for the entire thing, with being 15% impervious and existing and 85% impervious. It spits out 0.63 pounds required reduced a year, which turns into about $10,000 or $12,000 worth of nutrient credits. Next slide. Quantity. This purple line is the drainage area. If you imagine Stribling is approximately on a ridge line, doesn't quite drain everything to the north, drains to the north and everything to the south. There is some bucking grade, if you will, here. So you can see outfall 1 receives water from those houses that we talked about. That's the vicinity we're looking at with the driveway and the inlet. Those flow towards the road. Outfall 2, it flows towards the road from the south. And vice versa, and so forth as you move through here. But that's what the drainage area looks like. So as we move to the outfall conditions, next slide. Next slide. So this is what was provided by the consultant and the development team. This is outfall 1. They show replacing those inlets and extending the pipe with outlet protection. Outfall 2, they show a 36-inch storage pipe in the right of way. Next slide. Outfall 3, there's just replacing that pipe in one of the inlets, and outfall 4 has another detention facility in the right of way. Next slide. So this is outfall 2. The purple is a 36-inch pipe that's being proposed to be installed there to detain water. There's a few issues with this. We really frown on putting detention in the right of way for a whole litany of reasons. It gets added to our public service crew list of pre-storm activities. You need to go make sure all these things are not full of leaves, not clogged. And then generally you're supposed to have self-cleaning inlets in the right of way. You're not supposed to have them flat where silt can be collected. They're supposed to be self-cleaning and maintain a minimum velocity of 2 feet per second. Furthermore, the orange lines here are all gas, the yellow sewer, the blue is water. There's a lot going on here. If you imagine just looking at this in plan view, if you sort of look from the side, most of those things would have to be relocated. So I did not bother estimating what the cost of something like this would be. I just scratched it. But I did want to illustrate that the more you look into a concept, when you go from concept to design development, things get more expensive. It's extremely rare where somebody says, oh, we'll have to adjust this. I just made it cheaper. That very rarely happens. Next slide. So more likely what we'd have to do is these revised conceptual outfalls. This is outfall 1. Again, I just did some rough comps and I got a Q10 or discharge in the 10-year storm of 8 CFS and discharge in the 2-year storm of 4.16, which translates looking at that swale to a velocity of 4.7 feet per second, which is likely erosive. Next slide, Brian. This is what that looks like right now. It doesn't look too bad, but as you can see, that inlet gets very little water, as does the other. After those flows creep through the people's front yards, in over the curb or over the grass berm, into the road, into the inlet, it comes out. Be happening a lot faster in the closed condition. Next slide. So that pipe would at least need to be extended down some distance till you can find a natural channel that will accept it without being erosive. Next slide. This is outfall 2. So again, this is the one where the consultant showed that detention pipe. Next slide. This is that pipe shown, or the inlet shown rather there. You can see in picture left. In the right, that is where that pipe daylights right now. So that would need to be addressed. Next picture. We'd have to, you can see the consultant showed that pipe system that discharges just sort of a little bit in front of where those people's houses are, which is never a good idea. So I just showed it sort of arbitrarily continuing beyond there. Again, we need to identify an acceptable outfall location. Next slide. And this is a picture of where that pipe would have to go, whether it's the shorter pipe from the consultant or the pipe that I showed. The point being that that is not costed as a line item for storm drain installation. You can see the utility pole. There are gas utilities in there. And there's no receiving channel. Right now, it essentially doesn't function. So there's very little erosion, but that would have to be investigated. Next slide. This is outfall 3. This is, again, you can see the consultants proposing replacing this pipe in the roadway for some reason. Next picture. This is that outfall. This is what the manhole looks like on the left. You can see all that mud. This is the outfall pipe. That mud is the same mud in the left picture. So if this picture has, or that pipe, which is maybe 8 inches, has about 1.5 inches of cover. In fact, if you go to the next picture, you can see the pipe under the ground there. And the gentleman, one of the gentlemen that lives there told me that the only place he's ever seen water coming out of the ground is that hole, which is hard to see, but it's under his truck. I went downstream. He gave me permission to go downstream and look. Next slide. I found no pipe outlets, but this is where that water ends up going. This is, you can see, is adjacent foundation. The city is not in, the city cannot contribute more water to this situation and expect not to be hearing some problems. So next slide. Well, I thought I had showed a pipe going in there. At any rate, that pipe would have to be extended beyond their house. That requires considerable construction, mobilization, easements, sediment erosion control, it's the whole thing. And then this is outfall 4. That's essentially the city-county line. Slide left. And next slide. I didn't do a full analysis of it. I did not go down and look where it went. Looks like it's a pretty good sized pipe. It almost certainly, based on all my experience working in the city these last 3 years, it does not discharge to an acceptable outfall, and something would need to be done, whether it's quantity mitigation at the street, a bioretention or something, or running that pipe and doing some channel upgrades. Next slide. So I had $53,000 for the first outfall, $75,000 for the second outfall, $100,000 for the third, and I just threw a number at $80,000 at the fourth because that would involve more analysis than I'm prepared to do at this time. Next slide. Utility relocation. Again, I only added these two water lines you see here. These are the storm drains we talked about earlier. The blue is the water line. You can't put utilities 2 feet away from each other anymore. So we'd have to move that water line. Now you move that water line, all of a sudden it's closer to the gas line. You got to move the gas line and it continues. I did not reflect very much cost for utility relocation in my estimate, however. Next slide. Similarly, all those blue circles, those are all utility poles. The consultant identified 4 that would need to be relocated. I identified at least 16. And again, that's based on having sidewalk on one side. And those are about $10,000 a pop. Next slide. Roadway improvement costs. I did reduce the cost for sidewalk because I only had one sidewalk in my concept where the applicant had 2 sidewalks. Next slide. Other considerations. Next slide. So the purple numbers are parking that would be lost. And that's feasibly lost, and that the sidewalk would likely displace them. I'm not sure the zoning, but there's lots of like shared use rental houses there and the whole thing. But this was my determination of what physically could actually go back. So that being said, there's 21 spaces lost. 4 are the on-street, which are sort of right down there near JPA, then 3 throughout and 4 further down. And again, if the layout were to change from what I put together here, all that changes, usually gets worse, not better. Next slide. Then tree removal, I counted 19 trees. Next slide. You can see these trees would be removed in both these images is pretty close to JPA. Next slide. All these trees would be removed. This is the one on the right's down near Huntley Hall, and the one on the left is getting closer to Huntley Hall, moving west. Next picture. There's another tree beyond Huntley Hall that would have to be removed. And then, so just again, to sort of show the complication of these things, the tree on the left is near that second driveway I showed a picture of. If you're chasing that driveway 60 feet down to tie in, that tree's not going to be there anymore. And then the tree on the right, that is not where I expect a sidewalk, but if you could see those power lines against the tree, if we're moving power poles, if you move 3 power poles, all of a sudden you got to move 6 power poles. And now those wires have to move through that tree or into that tree, and there might be more displacement there. Next slide. So the original cost amount was 1.2 million with a 25% contingency of 1.5. I say original, this is what the developer provided. And then after I revised it, and you can see the categories there, the largest chunk was in roadwork. And then after I did the analysis, I adjusted all of those things and it went to 2.4 million almost, with a 20% contingency, bringing it to $2.8 million. You can see there's significantly more in here for landscaping, which is where all of the offsite driveways went in because that's where the consultant had them on their line item spreadsheet. I had a design and survey for $217,000. And then drainage got considerably more, as well as erosion cemetery relocation and mobilization. So that's utility relocation. All of the utility poles are in there. Yeah, so I believe that's it. Any questions?
Thank you. Counselors, any questions?
I have a few. And these are just for knowledge, not saying go out and study this, but just, you know, what you might have off the top of your head.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the ability to potentially turn that road one way?
That'd be tough, because that'd be tough. It would be tough. Let's see. You know, it connects to Sunset and Huntley, but the only other way out to JPA would be Sunset, I believe, or does Sunset turn into something else? Stripling, here we go.
Well, Stribling makes a loop.
Well, it does. But you're talking about the county access single lane gravel thing that takes you to Fontaine you're talking about?
You're right.
I mean, you think these costs are expensive. Turning that into something would get, you know. Yeah, with all the issues on Huntley, as is with widths, et cetera. I don't, that would be hard.
Okay. Question, are gravel driveways okay? I thought gravel driveways were not allowed in the city.
They're not allowed in the city. They have to be a non-erodible surface for, I want to say 50 feet at least, if not 75 feet. Not allowed and not permitted for future projects are sort of different things. Obviously, we don't, property maintenance doesn't go out there and say, hey, you have a gravel driveway. But so if we were to do it and somebody had a 100-foot gravel driveway, we'd have to do it to code, which I want to say is 50 feet non-erodible. And non-erodible is asphalt, concrete, or some kind of interlocking paver system or something that we, you know, would approve.
Okay. And just curious, I know that you mentioned that the consultant said there was 4 utility poles that needed to be moved, but you counted 16, so I was kind of confused if that gets discrepancy.
I can't speak to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all.
Mhm.
I was just curious because obviously when this was discussed last publicly, the intersection at JPA was another topic. Right now, this doesn't even address any of that concern. Just wanted to clarify.
That's correct. There's a separate project for pedestrian crossings at the intersection of JPA Stribling, as well as up and down JPA, a couple 100 feet at any rate. There's like, I want to say there's 6 individual areas that are being addressed with bump outs, et cetera. We're undertaking that anyway under the various projects and various funding mechanisms. That is not associated with this, but there is plans in the work to provide like bump outs to serve the crosswalks in that area, but that is not.
Some residents went a step further though and just felt that even having signalization at that intersection, if you consider the additional demand of this development, was of concern. So I wasn't sure if there was thoughts on that.
Now, I'd have to go back and check to see if there's flashers or what it is at those crossings. I don't recall that right now. I know our last CIP sort of filled it up that we could, because that project grew in scope as well and cost out of the original estimate. So I believe now, as of the last, this FY, whatever FY we just turned into, we have enough money to do that project. So we are reviewing the consultant's proposal again to change orders and whatnot to get that one done. So it is
But
not.
that's just pedestrian infrastructure, not
That's just,
vehicular
no, there is no
signalization.
signal or anything like that, correct?
So I guess where are we going from here?
So if I could, Mayor Walker and council members, I'll just add, as we had conversation, the staff in preparing for today, where we are is that we are looking at the moment, $850,000 gap based on what the proffer that we have received is and what we have come up with our new estimate. That in itself, I guess the way I'd like to present it to you to consider is that we have 170 units that are being proposed by the developer with 15%, so 25 units being offered up for rental for 10 years and ownership for 30 years. So we're looking at 60% AMI. So that's basically the investment that is being placed in front of you is $850,000 from the city, worth it to receive 25 units for that hybrid rental ownership opportunity over 10 years and then extended over 30 years in the case of ownership. Because of the stresses that we face with the decisions that we have to make regarding schools and all the various priorities that we have, that's a tall order at this moment of coming up with 850,000. This particular item would then, in essence, be jumping ahead of other items that are on the CIP list. So all that needs to be factored into how you're looking at if we support this. But ultimately, just wanted to put that in front of you as the proposition before you is $850,000 investment for 25 units of affordable housing. Is that what you're looking for?
And just a quick question. There was a statement made earlier, right after, I think it was Mr. Freeze was talking about the 15% and 60% AMI, but it said that the developer, it was said that the developer has offered 2 million of future revenue towards, and then I didn't catch the rest of that statement.
Yeah, so right now the plan would be that they would pay up front for the $2 million. And then they would recover those dollars back as this development accrues like revenue from the tax base. So in a kind of like a TIF. So, it's going to generate revenue for the city because we don't have the money to do this up front. It's infrastructure is really, typically something that we would be looking to pursue. There's no money for this clearly. And so they brought forward an idea that they would basically upfront $2 million to pay for the costs up to that amount. And then over the course of that project would be paid back by the city with the revenue that was generated from the actual development.
But we've also had conversations about these type of things should be included in new developments, not as city sponsored. So how, I haven't watched this on the planning commission, but how do we get to the paying back in some way part?
Because that's the street that they were talking about isn't actually part of the development itself. It's an access point.
Well, I understand that, but it's still for the community to be comfortable with us even considering this. This is something that they would like to see happen. So is that not the case?
If I can try and explain, hopefully, if I can the question. So because Stribling is an existing roadway, that's an existing accepted roadway. It's not a great, it doesn't meet our even basic requirements for two-way traffic, but it's an existing roadway. So under our code, all they have to do is a traffic impact analysis that focuses heavily on vehicular impacts. I'm not a traffic engineer, but they look at the level of service of various intersections for X number of things. And so this is likely to pass that because those traffic analyses don't look at pedestrian conflicts. They don't look at, it looks at signal timing and how long you have to wait to take a left turn. So, and this is not unlike, I remember Councilor Snook made something similar about another project that didn't have enough parking and everybody was gonna walk. And so why don't we have something that says you need to at least build a sidewalk to another sidewalk if you're gonna come in front of us and say all of these things. Our code does not support that. We don't really have adequacy of public facilities requirement here for any of those sorts of things. So if they were to do a by right development, this would almost certainly pass whatever traffic analysis that there would be, and they would be allowed to do this. Our code does not say you need to have adequate pedestrian travel from X to X or anything like that.
And the by right here is how many units?
I want to say on the order of 42 or something like that, if I remember correctly, just from sitting through this before.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Comments?
Well, it just seems like that there's a difference in estimations here, obviously, and Jack stepped us through just some of the complications of the site. It's hard though, because like this is a priority area we've heard about, even aside from this PUD. This is something that this neighborhood has certainly highlighted as an issue. And having walked it a few times, I can understand why. And it's certainly, obviously, the pedestrian access is what we've all been focusing on, but it comes with a lot of other complications to really address this street to bring it to where it needs to. I guess my biggest struggle right now is just this delta and where we would get those funds from, given where we are with everything else. At the same time, I think we're resigning to the fact that I think I've heard from the Planning Commission and among us that if we don't have the infrastructure, this project as presented can't go through. It's just not really feasible to put that much demand.
And in terms of, and I do need to go back and do some more homework on this, but if we are talking about the TIF, I don't know what the duration would be, but we have to factor that into everything else that we have sitting before us that's already causing great pause for future considerations for a 5 to 10 year period. And so that would have implications in the future, and we're already doing some of those for the PHA project, CRHA project. We've done it for Carlton Views. And so I don't know if, based on the 25 units at 10 and 30 years, if I understand that the community may need something, but we've also talked about updating the unfunded CIP list and putting things on there in order and figuring out a way to prioritize those things. So this would seem where we would be at in the conversation versus trying to figure the funding out right now.
Yeah, and I guess I would just, my thought is that it seems like realistically, like that $850,000 just is not really feasible in terms of being ahead of other priorities. Even just in affordable housing, you know, $850,000 donated, or not donated, but invested in projects PHA or others are doing would yield more units at lower AMI levels for a longer period of time. Just even if we're just thinking about 850,000 strictly to housing. And when we look at our CIP and other investments, I just think realistically, it's going to be pretty hard, if not impossible, for that to really jump up above these other priorities.
But if we're considering a TIF, we have to factor in the entire amount and not just the 850, because we'll lose that in revenue.
Yeah, and that's the other trade-off on its own. And then the 850 makes that just even bigger and more immediate.
I think the recognition is like, if the infrastructure stuff doesn't happen, this project doesn't happen. So there's, and then what it looked, I mean, I'm not sure what the comparison is of the revenue for the 46 or whatever number of units that there will be if it's done by right versus the revenue outlook on this project, but there certainly is a difference there. But I agree, and the 850 for me is certainly giving a lot of pause, and it's just we just have the information that's in front of us right now, and obviously, you know, it's nothing's firm in terms of what these estimates are, but I think we have to make a decision on what's in front of us.
Okay. So
what is the next formal step with the Planning Commission in this project? Because I know that during that last meeting, we said that we needed more information because there was just some discrepancies. So I guess, is this set still to go back to the Planning Commission for consideration? I mean,
Yes, this is set to go back to the Planning Commission, and ultimately, if they send it forward, then you all would, after considering it and approving it, would sign an agreement. And that probably wouldn't come back before you for at least 2 months.
are there any other questions at this time? Comments?
no, thank you to staff for presenting this information.
The only comment that I wanted to make is that although I am in favor of considering the kind of TIF or synthetic TIF or whatever we're calling this, combining that with, and oh, by the way, we're also going to dip in $850,000 in this current budget situation, gets to be a mighty difficult lift. So, not saying absolutely no, but sure not interested at the moment from what I'm seeing.
Okay. All right. Thank you all for the presentation. Next up, we have the discussion on budget development.
Good afternoon, Council. We are here this afternoon to talk to you a little bit about budget. We have kicked off the process. We are on our way. So what has happened to date is we have sent out information to departments requesting further information and updates on both their current CIP projects, new requests, and also updates on the unfunded list. Those were due back at the end of September, and we are starting to comb through those to compile information to be able to present and talk to you. We'll be going to the Planning Commission, a work session at the end of November with a public hearing on that on December 14th. So we are well on our way with the CIP. Additionally, we've sent out request information to departments for operating budgets. They have went out about 2 weeks ago, and departments are working on those. They are due back to the budget office November 5th. We'll be spending the month of November and December meeting with department heads to discuss their budgets, their submissions, and their proposals, to then be working on a proposed budget to present to council, which will be coming to you March 7th is when we'll actually be presenting the proposed budget. So we will have a work session on February 3rd to start talking about sort of the current budget situation. We have also reconvened our revenue team. We took a few months off, but we are back meeting on a regular basis to update and keep abreast of revenue changes as they're happening. So a lot of work behind the scenes. And also I would offer that if there are items or things that council has as a priority that you would like for us to consider as we are doing this, now would be a time to submit those as well, so we can make sure that we get those on the list and at least out there for all of your discussions. But that's sort of what our process is to date, given the current situation. We are still, this is the schedule we set out originally, so we're still going to do our best to keep to that. If things change and we have to make changes, of course, we'll keep you abreast, but that's our current plan. So I don't know if there's any questions or comments about that piece before we go on to the next part, exciting, more fun part.
And for council's items that we would like for you to consider, when would you all want that in?
Anytime. If you want to send them to us, we're happy to make sure that they get in the mix and on the list.
Okay, thank you.
So some other exciting news. We have been listening, and we have heard the cries and calls for more transparency, and want to take some time to introduce you to a new member of the budget office. His name is Brian Ray. He's been a city employee for some time. He worked in Parks and Rec, and we were lucky enough to have him join us in June as a systems analyst. And so he is working to help us do some cool and great things from a budget transparency standpoint, for budget dashboards, to be able to help present information in a meaningful way that we hope will, as this will continue to evolve. And so one exciting thing that he's here to demo for you today is something that's called a Budget Explorer that's now on our webpage. And so with that, I'm going to toss it over to Brian and let him do a demo for you.
All right, thanks, Chrissy. I just want to start out with a little bit of background. This project, it's really been in the works for probably about a year. And the original goal was to create sort of an internal decision support tool that would allow budget managers to perform reporting and analysis of their budgets as sort of an alternative to using our enterprise financial system, which can be a little cumbersome at times. We wanted to create something that was a little more intuitive and provide maybe a little bit more insight. So then a couple months ago, I was asked to sort of expand the scope to include a public-facing tool that would allow users to gain insights into the city's general fund budget. So the biggest challenge in this was really getting access to this data, sort of being able to talk to the enterprise financial system and sort of pull that data out. And this was accomplished through a collaboration with the IT and the finance departments, which ultimately allowed me to build the dashboard that you're getting ready to see here. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, can y'all see that? Okay, so this dashboard is located on the budget website. So that's where I've navigated to right here. And then you can see this little icon here called the Budget Explorer. So if you just click on this icon, that'll take you over to the Budget Explorer page. And so this is the dashboard that we've built. A really helpful thing to when you first start using this is this sort of user guide that I've created. So if you just click right here, opens up this user guide, and this, I'm going to basically walk you through what's covered in this guide here. So if you navigate to the website and you want to play around with this Budget Explorer, it's helpful to open this up and kind of get an explanation of what you're looking at and sort of how to use the tool. All right, so now back to the tool here. All right, so what you're looking at here is the dashboard. So I'm going to kind of just walk through everything you see here. It's kind of a lot to look at first, but I think it'll start to make sense once I start to sort of walk you through each of these visualizations and sort of start clicking around on the dashboard. So we'll start with these three sort of charts over here on the right. I guess the way you can sort of look at this is these tables over here on the right sort of describe the data that you're seeing. And over here on the left, these sort of tables over here allow you to select the data that you want to analyze. So starting with these sort of descriptive visualizations over here, this top one is the percent of the total FY22 adopted budget that we are looking at in this current view. So we've selected nothing. We're basically looking at the entire budget as a whole. So we're looking at 100% of the FY22 adopted budget in all these visualizations. The table below that is called totals and changes, but from FY21 adopted to 22 adopted. So basically we have your FY21 adopted total, your FY22 adopted total, the dollar and the percentage change between those two amounts. And like I said, we're looking at 100% of the budget. So this is 100% of the general fund budget right here for 21 and then 22. And then the final sort of descriptive visualization here is this trend line, which just represents the FY19 actuals, FY20 actuals, 21 adopted budget, and 22 adopted budget. So that sort of gives you a trend line to show you the sort of trajectory that we're on. All right, so those are sort of the descriptive visualizations. And like I said, over here on the left, these visualizations allow you to sort of select the data that you want to sort of analyze. And the one thing to know about the dashboard is anything that is sort of colored yellow here, that represents something that is interactive. In other words, I can click these yellow areas to filter the rest of the dashboard. So for example, up here at the top, right now we're looking at the expense side. If I were to click here, you can see now all of the visualizations have now changed to represent the revenue side. So this product is called Tableau, and that's really one of the powerful sort of advantages of Tableau is this interactivity. So, when I click back to expenses, if you look at, all these visualizations, they all change and are filtered relative to what I've clicked here. So I've now clicked back to expenses. So now we're back looking at the expense side. So that's our revenue expense selector. And then we'll move down to these three tables right here. These represent, I guess, what I would call sort of the organizational units within the city, which is simply sort of our departments at the top level here. The level below that would be the divisions that departments are made up of. And then the level below that would be the cost centers that divisions are made up of. So it's just sort of a hierarchy of organizational structure. And each of these tables here has a little bar that represents the sort of relative amount of dollar amount for each of these sort of departments, divisions, or cost centers. So this bar represents, the contribution to schools, and if you hover over, you can see it's $58 million. So that's the largest sort of chunk of money for any department that contributes to the overall FY22 budget. So that's sort of the hierarchy here, and then down below, we have the actual line items. So this gets right down to the line item level. So this is, if you scroll down, this is all of the line items in the entire city budget are represented here. Like I said, we're looking at 100% of the budget currently. So this is every line item and the full amount sort of citywide. It's not specific to any department. This is the entire city budget. So that's sort of an overview of all of the visualizations. So now I just want to walk through kind of how you use the tool to sort of gain insights. I showed you how you can sort of select between revenues, expenses by clicking up here. So now I want to sort of demonstrate two I guess, sort of methodologies that maybe to gain insights into the budget. And I call it the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. So we'll start with the top-down approach. And what I mean by that is we're going to use the visualizations here in the organizational unit section to sort of isolate departments and divisions sort of here at the top, and then explore down at the bottom, explore the line items that result from those filters. So I'm just going to use a department that I'm familiar with for the demo. I'm going to use the Parks and Rec department. So if we scroll down here to Parks and Recreation, like I said, all these yellow areas are filter, they're areas that you can use to filter. So I'm going to click Parks and Recreation here. And now you watch all of the visualizations have now changed to represent Parks and Recreation. So you can see now we were looking at 100% of the budget. Now that we've selected Parks and Rec, you can see Parks and Rec is 6.2% of the entire general fund budget. Similarly, the totals and changes have filtered to only Parks and Recreation. So the FY21 adopted 11.5 million, FY22 was 11.9 million for an increase of 378,000 or 3.3%. As well, this trend line has also now been filtered to represent just the Parks and Recreation sort of trend. If you hover over these, you can see the historical values of these totals here. So while you can filter, by department, you can also drill down further within a department to get the same sort of insight. Oh, and I didn't mention, but now at the bottom, we are now just looking at the line items for the Parks and Rec budget. So this is the entire Parks and Recreation budget line item by line item. So similarly, we can leave this Parks and Rec filter on, and we can move down and say, okay, well, what about a division of Parks and Rec? What if we want to explore the sort of the budget of one of the divisions? We can actually click again, drill further down. We can click aquatics. So now you can see everything's changed again. Now we're just looking only at the aquatics budget, which now only represents 1.3% of the total budget. Here's the 2021 and 22, the change in percent, as well as the trend. And now we're looking at the line items for only the aquatics division. And then finally, you can drill down even further to a particular facility or cost center within aquatics. So if we wanted to look at Smith Fitness and Aquatic Center, we click here. And now we have drilled all the way down to this, to this facility. This is that particular facility's line item budget. It represents 0.5% of the entire city budget. And here's the changes over between 21 and 22, and here's your trend line. So it's a really powerful tool. And this demonstrates the sort of top-down analysis that I was talking about. You sort of choose a department or division or cost center and sort of get the metrics and the line item details for that area that you've selected. So now I want to show you sort of the other approach, which I call the bottom up. And one important thing to understand about this tool, and it's outlined in the how-to guide, but there's little buttons down here at the bottom. Once you start clicking these filters, sometimes you can get lost, and you can really kind of click them back to get back out. But the easiest way to just get back to the beginning is to click this little arrow right here called reset. Click there, and then you're just back to where you started. Now we're looking back at 100% of the budget again. So now I just want to demonstrate the other sort of methodology that I think is pretty insightful as well, which I would call bottom-up analysis. So instead of starting up here with the sort of org units and then investigating the line items, I'm going to sort of do the opposite. So I'm going to start down here at the line item budgets. I think I'm going to select temporary salaries as an example. So instead of clicking a department, I'm going to click on a line item. So I'm going to click temporary salaries. And when I click this, you can watch up here, all these metrics are going to change to represent the temporary salaries. So click here. Now everything has changed. And now up at the top, sort of what we're looking at up here now is the relative contribution to the temp salaries line of each of these departments and divisions. So now you can see Parks and Recreation has moved to the very top of the list, and really by a long shot. They by far contribute the most dollars in the entire city to this temporary salaries line item. And you can hover over it and get the total. You can scroll down and see the sort of relative bars relative to Parks and Recreation. And the same thing over here with the metrics. You can see that temporary salaries is 1.8% of the whole budget. Here was 21 and 22 adopted, and the dollar and percent changes. And here's the trend line over time for the temporary salaries line item. So that's sort of the bottom up approach. And once again, you click the reset button here, and now we're just back to looking at 100% of the budget. So that really kind of sums it up. Sort of the nickel tour there. It's available on the website, and it's really kind of cool and kind of fun to play with. So, feel free to go and click around and explore the budget, I guess. Anybody have any questions?
Oh, that is great. Yeah, I look forward to, taking time to go and explore. But counselors, any questions or comments?
No, just appreciation for the work here to provide this kind of a tool to the community. I heard it was coming, and I'm super excited to kind of see it out there live.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Brian.
Now, this on the front page of the website, or do you have to go to the budget page to get to it?
You have to go to the budget page. So here's the budget page.
Mhm.
And then this little icon right here, Budget Explorer.
Mhm. Is there a link to it on the front page?
There is not, but that could certainly be something that can be added.
Any other questions or comments?
Thank you. This is what transparency is about, and it's really awesome. Thank you.
I'm going to enjoy wasting a lot of time after 2 o'clock in the morning clicking around.
Yeah, I think, the public has been asking for this for a long time, and it seems like it's a user-friendly creation. So that looks very good. Thank you all for working on that very much.
Yeah, and then when we present the proposed budget in March, this will be updated with the 23 budget. So during the work sessions and as we have conversations, you'll be able to use this tool as well when you're looking to make decisions on what you want to put in the approved budget.
Mhm. Yeah, that's good. That would have been helpful for a lot of years. So yeah. All right. Well, if there are any other, that's great. That looks really good. So counselors, are there any other questions or comments? No. All right. Thank you all for that presentation. And I'm sure once we go clicking through it, if there are any questions that come up in the future, we'll ask them. All right. Thank you. All right. So next up, Mr. Willer, if you could check and see if there's any one that would like to speak.
Thank you, Mayor Walker. We've got 16 people in the audience right now. If you'd like to get in line to address council, please click the raise hand icon in the Zoom webinar. Each person will have up to 3 minutes. First up is Jason Halbert. Jason, you're on with council. You've got 3 minutes.
Hi, I just wanted to follow up on the Stribling discussion. I appreciate what Engineer Dawson did, and I want to reiterate that I'm the co-president of the Fry Springs Neighborhood Association. I live on Jefferson Park Circle, sorry. I want to reiterate that we have long said that we're not, as a board, although some of the neighbors are fully opposed to the project, we are not as a board fully opposed to the project and want to see some sort of solution eventually. But I think the conclusion that you all seem to have come to is the right one. And clearly, given the city's priorities with affordable housing and school reconfiguration and lack of all the money we would love to have, this is not the right project for the right time. That road is still in need of CIP monies that we've been asking for over a decade. And so I appreciate what you've done here, what the engineer did. And I hope that when this comes back to you from the developer, whom we're still willing to work with, that the city council will reiterate what you said here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've got one other hand up right now. Peter Krebs, you're on with council, and you've got 3 minutes.
Hey, good evening, council. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And actually, both of those presentations really upped my respect for first the engineering profession, but also for the systems engineering, profession. So it was amazing. I think it's actually super relevant that you're talking about both this sidewalk situation and the budget situation. Councilor, I believe it was Payne, pointed out that it isn't a super high priority as far as where we're looking to have affordable housing. It is a priority in terms of sidewalks, but it's not even on that list that's in the comprehensive plan of like 20 projects. So just keep that in mind when you're developing the CIP. Although it was a super complicated project that like $800,000 is actually sort of not all that atypical. If you look through the priorities list, that's the sort of tranche that is needed for sidewalk projects. Same thing with the comp plans priority sidewalks list. So just keep that in mind at budget time. And that's it for now. Thank you all for your service and have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll make one more call for any hands. If you're on via telephone, you can press *9. There will be additional opportunities at the 6:30 meeting. Mayor Walker, I don't see any other hands.
Okay, thank you. All right, so next up we have the closed session. So Councilor Hill, would you like to read us into closed session?
Sure. Pursuant to section 2.23712 of the Virginia Code, I hereby move that the City Council close this open meeting and convene within a closed meeting as authorized by Virginia Code section 2.23711A1, A7, and A8 for discussion of prospective candidates for employment as interim city manager, discussion and consideration of the relationships among city councilors and among city councilors and the city attorney's office, update regarding pending litigation, Charlottesville Circuit Court Civic Case number CL21-116, and a personnel matter appealed pursuant to section 13.5 of the grievance procedures, and consultation with legal counsel regarding resignation of the city manager and administrative and operational matters within the city manager's office and police department.
Second.
Thomas?
Mayor Walker,
Yes.
Vice Mayor McGill,
Yes.
Councilor Hill,
Yes.
Councilor Payne,
Yes.
Councilor Smith.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so you all should have the link for the closed session.
Okay.
And council, you'll return to a different webinar for the 6:30 meeting.
Thank you for confirming. I was just going to ask.